1800s, Spanish settlers in Florida were in the middle of a serious conflict with the British residents of Carolina, an area which consisted of modern-day Georgia, as well as North and South Carolina. As a result, they needed a fort that could act as a buffer to protect them. So in 1681, Fort Mose was founded, just north of St. Augustine. With so many escaped slaves seeking freedom in Spanish Florida, the settlers decided that the fort should be run by freed black men. In total, 38 men ran the fort and established what is now recognized as the very first all-black town in North America. When Florida was later ceded to Britain in the Paris Treaty of 1763, the freedmen were no longer welcome. Many were forced to flee to the Seminole Nation, thus beginning the Seminole Nation's alliance with the Black Seminoles. The relationship between the Black Seminoles and the Native Seminoles was, to say the least, complicated. The two groups were partners of chance who joined together as a team when it was to their benefit and parted ways when it wasn't. They shared much of their respective cultures with one another and further unified themselves by practicing intermarriage over the generations. They were also one of the first American communities to navigate the murky waters of joining two different ethnic groups, something that would become a bit of a motif in American history. While they weren't recognized for it back then, today's scholars are finally beginning to acknowledge the important strides that these two very different groups made by joining together. The home of the Seminole Nation has changed many times and spans across several states and countries. After the War of 1812, both the Native and Black Seminoles moved from northern Florida into the southern and central areas of the state. They were doing their best to get away from encroaching white settlers, which turned out to be a prudent decision. In the early 1820s, a large group even had to escape to the Bahamas. After the Second Seminole War, which ended in 1842, many Seminoles and escaped slaves were removed to yet another new territory in Oklahoma. However, others chose a different path and ended up in Texas and northern Mexico. Around 1816, General Andrew Jackson, the future 7th President of the United States, was charged with the forced removal of any runaway slaves who were being sheltered by the bands of Black Seminoles. To accomplish this task, he adopted a strategy that mostly consisted of the burning and raiding of Seminole villages. These attacks, as you probably aren't surprised to learn, quickly became the catalyst for the first major conflict between the white settlers and the Seminole Nation. Although the Black Seminoles fought back, Jackson captured the Spanish-held cities of Pensacola and St. Marks. Ultimately, the Spanish would end up ceding Florida in 1819, as well as giving up their claims for sovereign Spanish rule in Texas. From 1835 to 1842, the Seminole Nation once again found themselves waging a brutal war against the white settlers who wanted their land. As it happened, the land that had been granted to them by the United States as a reservation turned out to be very desirable to plantation owners looking to expand their operations. Not realizing how valuable the land was when they gave it away, the settlers demanded it back, and the resulting conflict was absolutely devastating. Not wanting to leave their home, the Seminole tribes fought back against the Indian Removal Act. It was a costly war for the United States, with estimates of the expense ranging between $40 and $60 million, which today would be well over $1 billion.
Expansion is a mighty fine thing. Sure, we gotta grow, but not at the expense of the things this country was founded to protect.
If you really want to be a CEO, want to be an entrepreneur, you should take the first step. Create the LLC. It doesn't really cost that much.
Many, if not most, scholars, including those who focused on African American studies, surprisingly overlooked the significance of the Seminole Uprising for a long time. For nearly 150 years, it was all but forgotten, as most history books focused on the role of the native Seminole fighters rather than on the escaped slaves and the Black Seminoles who fought alongside them. From 1835 to 1838, roughly 385 to 465 runaway slaves and 500 to 800 Black Seminoles fought alongside their native Seminole counterparts in the Second Seminole War, forming an even stronger alliance, one that would eventually win them their freedom. On May 28, 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. It still took officials a number of years to actually evict the Seminoles from the land. Many other tribes from across the American Southeast were also forcefully relocated into an area west of the Mississippi that became known as Indian Territory.
You Indians, get out of here! Get out of here! Get out of here! Get out of here!
Orleans, where they were placed on a boat that would take them to their new land at Fort Gibson. Having been promised their freedom if they went along, a group of 250 Seminoles, including a large number of black Seminoles, agreed to the terms of their journey.
The lowest classes of white people are flogging the Cherokees with cowhides, hickories, and clubs. We are not safe in our house.
After the Second Seminole War, white plantation owners quickly realized that it wasn't going to be in their best interest to admit that they were defeated by black rebels. In an attempt to appease both sides, the black members of the rebellion were granted their freedom, and the incident was purposefully swept under the rug of American history. Although slaves had been granted their freedom in other situations, this was the only time before the Civil War where freedom was granted to runaway slaves. When slavery was still being practiced in the southern United States, the plantation owners' grip on power was paramount. Plantation owners had to maintain their control over slaves to ensure the continuation of their businesses and the lifestyles that they had established for themselves. This dynamic plays a large role in explaining why the escaped slaves who fought in the Second Seminole War were largely forgotten by history. It was in the plantation owners' interest to downplay any occurrences of slave rebellion, particularly those that were successful, so that other captives wouldn't try it themselves. A system of euphemisms was used in newspapers to get the story out, without any African Americans realizing what had happened.
What people don't know is that enslaved people always resisted, always fought for their freedom.
Born in 1812, and also known as Juan Caballo, John Horace was a black Seminole who grew up among the Oconee Seminole. As a boy, he learned to hunt and fish and became proficient with both bows and arrows and rifles. In contrast to many of his contemporaries, John also learned to read and write in several languages. He is known to have a working knowledge of Spanish, English, and the Hichiti tongue, spoken by the Oconee. Among other things, he would go on to lead the largest slave uprising in American history during the Second Seminole War. He also met two presidents, was an advisor to multiple Seminole chiefs, and later served as a distinguished officer in the Mexican military. Toward the end of his life, he led his people from Florida to northern Mexico, where he provided them with a safe place to live, a place that his descendants still reside in today. John Horace led an incredible life by anyone's standards, and by the time he died at age 70, he had accomplished his dream of securing a land where his people could live freely.
The stars twinkle as the dirge-like ancestral music of the Indians echoes through the solemn stillness of the night.
The Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole tribes were considered to be the primary Native American nations that white settlers and African Americans had relationships with. The first four held slaves for various purposes, and in most cases they worked on large plantations or farms. The Seminole relationship with blacks, on the other hand, was quite different, and there was far less chattel slavery involved. Instead, black Seminoles were viewed as free men. Although they never seemed to gain complete acceptance into the Seminole Nation, they still enjoyed far more rights than African Americans in Indian country did. It can sometimes be difficult to determine who was part of a particular ethnic group and who is not. The question becomes much more complicated when a historical reparation payout of $56 million is added into the equation. We're referring to a conflict that arose in 2002 when the federal government awarded a huge settlement to the members of the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma. The situation had already become tense with regard to the acceptance of the black Seminoles into the tribe before that happened, and the money didn't make things any easier when it came to determining who got what. Many of the people arguing for inclusion pointed out that there has been a long history of intermarriage between the black Seminoles and Native Seminoles, and that the settlement should be rightfully shared. The black Seminoles attempted to sue the federal government for their share, but in 2004, the United States Supreme Court ruled against them. The court held that the suit couldn't move forward without the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma being joined as a party. However, the Seminoles of Oklahoma refused to join, and as a sovereign nation, the court could not force them to.